in the hotel lobby and we said, you know what we should do to teaching what's been done with content? Like, teaching should be open. Like, why do you just have to get access to content? Why can't you have that whole experience? Because online, the cost of duplication approaches near zero, which alters the economics of teaching and content and everything. So we wanted to move from this model, which had, faculty, core curriculum, and content, to a model that looked a little bit like this, where you had peripheral learners. You basically had a messy ecosystem of learning, engagement, passion, the things we care about. And so that was our vision. And we ran probably about half a dozen MOOCs. In our case, I don't know if we had more than 15,000 students in all those MOOCs put together, but that's sort of what we did. And then you know the rest of the narrative. Suddenly MOOCs were a big deal on a number of prominent campuses across the US. Not to be outdone, a number of international groups got involved with MOOCs as well. A whole range of peripheral startups got involved in MOOCs. And so suddenly we have a revolution. And we have clay shirky, a Latin term that means everything that's new is an MP3. Used the illustration that higher education was being disrupted, and guess what? Napster. Udacity was our Napster. So I love these kinds of things. We really need to hold people who say freaking stupid things accountable in retrospect. And now you see a lot of MOOCs happening. You see a lot of options on a monthly basis. You can take MOOCs wherever you go. We were approaching something in the range of 25 million learners that are taking MOOCs. Hundreds of millions. I would approach, we're probably in excess of billions of dollars invested if you include the costs that individual campuses have put into the running of MOOCs. We've put billions of dollars into this experiment. We've had a terrific amount of media exposure. Finally, as educators, we're filled with joy because guess what? People want to talk to us now, right? Like New York Times wants to ask me what I think of MOOCs. And you get on TV programs and you get on conference panels, and your main job at a conference panel 2 years ago was to say something more outrageous than the guy that spoke before you. And so it was just a wonderful time. But then suddenly reality hit for some folks. And that reality was that if you create a view or idea that is disconnected from humanity but driven by technology, in the long run, you're going to hit a wall. If you don't care about research that exists and try and build a field from scratch, whole cloth, you're going to hit a wall. And so, of course, as media being, and there's a lot of faculty who sat on the side and were disengaged from some of the activity going on with MOOCs. But they were scared, and I spoke with faculty. You've, I'm sure, been to conferences where faculty ranted against MOOCs and so on. But when Udacity said they had a lousy product, there was a lot of very happy people out there. And a lot of them were academics. See, this stuff is crap. We told you. Why didn't you listen to us? And the narrative went on. And in some research that I did with a few doctoral students in Dragan Gasevich, we looked at the prevalence of MOOC-related terms in public media. And we really peaked in the third quarter 2013. And since then, we've seen a very steady decline in how public media has started to cover MOOCs. And that's also reflected in the decline within Google searches and so on. So essentially, MOOCs, that beautiful partner on the horizon that was going to fulfill us and complete us, ended up being a shorter-term relationship than many of us had intended. And as we started to see the top citations from the top journals, Australian Financial Review, Chronicle of Higher Ed, you've got New York Times, you've got Washington Post. There were some prominent publications that had an enormous love affair with the idea of MOOCs as a way of challenging what education does. When we started looking at some of the data that actually existed within MOOCs and existed in the reports that people were publishing, we found there was a slightly different narrative that we needed to address. Oh, I just got a text from Shane. That was mean. He's Australian, so it's okay. So the reality of MOOCs then was that there was actually, it wasn't as disruptive as people said. It was occurring within the existing context of higher education. We had, the methodologies wasn't as quantitative as the narrative was. We actually had heavily mixed methodologies in most of the research projects that we looked at. So by way of background, we did the MOOC Research Initiative. We had initially, I think, something like 300 submissions. We narrowed it down to 80 that we requested a full submission of, and then we funded about 25 of those. And we did an analysis of the sources and the citations and the language that was used in those submissions to come to understand how is, with this very biased data set, how are people and researchers starting to think about MOOCs. And so we found actually they're thinking about it in a pretty academic-y type of way. The methodologies involved heavy representation from the education faculty, by far the largest field of submissions, 106. The next nearest submission was 21 in terms of the field that they represent as a primary domain. And then we went through an agglomerative hierarchical clustering method to sort of look at what did we find from the data. Like what did, looking at the terms that were frequently used in the citations as well as in the documents that we received, we actually just found a series of pretty logical, decent things. We found there was engagement and learner success. Academics cared about this. MOOC design. Academics cared about this. Self-regulated and social learning. These were the ways in which computer science educators, sociologists, psychologists, and others were thinking about this. Heavy emphasis on networked learning as well, and then a big focus on motivation, attitude, and success. So in the end, we took a couple of those reports and we produced this. It's called Preparing for the Digital University. Together with Shane Dawson, Dragan Gasevich, and a number of doctoral students, we wanted to look at what do we see in the literature and going forward. We thought it was an okay report, but not everybody did. So just take it with a grain of salt. I may be biased. But, and then there's some other reports that came out at around this time, and I'm really trying to argue for is that the hype that we saw in media, academics weren't consumed with it at the same level that the media was. And it was just a moment for hypesters to get into education, drive a narrative, and then step out. And Fiona Hollins did a terrific report on this as well, looking at what's really happening. And this is reports from 2004, but that provided a research-oriented viewpoint of what was going on with MOOCs rather than sort of a hype-driven perspective. And I'll return to this report in a little bit. All right, so that was the MOOC narrative. That's kind of where we are. A lot of our narrative today is that we're going to continue to make learning more accessible. We're going to continue to make it cheaper. And we're not having, I think, yet quite the right narrative. So once I move a little further along on my little rant here today, I'm going to try and cash out some of these ideas in a way that indicates why I think a lot of this is in need of some significant rethinking. Playing with the system. So the higher education system, we know it's coming, it's going, it's being disrupted one day. The next day, disruption theory is proven to be completely untested and really just a nice narrative, not a research-oriented view of things. But it's okay, because if you have a foundation in your name, then you can get by with that sort of thing. And so we had, for example, certificates. This is by far the fastest growing form of credentialing. Now, if you want to be very clever, you take certificates and you call them nano degrees. And then you can market that stuff. I have no idea which company I'm picking on when I say that. So certificates are a big growing form of credentialing, which reflects a labor market in transition because you need to go back to the university marketplace to get upgraded and to advance your education. We've also seen a lot of interest in competencies and competency-based education as well. Huge interest. And programs, Department of Education, experimental sites, and so on, as well as entire companies or organizations are transitioning into this space. So it's a terrific time, really, for people who are thinking the existing power structures within the education space. But competency-based learning is messy stuff. It takes a lot of rethinking systemically. It's not quite as quick a rollout as I put a video online and 100,000 people showed up. But it also reflects the fragmentation that happens to information and knowledge in a networked age. That's, I think, the fundamental thing. We really have to consider three critical aspects when we start to meander mentally about what education could look like in the future. First thing we have to recognize is the digital space. Digital settings change power relationships. They change who has control and who has access to control. Secondly, the digital space also gives us an enormous opportunity for data and data collection, which is one of the reasons MOOCs have caught the interest of researchers literally across the academic spectrum. And then the third point is when you live in networks, it's a very different experience. You move from control to nudging in network systems, which means essentially you move your mechanisms for control to a more subversive layer where the individual might not at all be aware of how you're being nudged, but you're essentially trying to treat it as a control space to move learners where you want them to go. And so some of the things we've worked on as we've played around with different examples is stuff like this, where we're trying to aggregate multiple sources of data, conversations, and interaction. This is a course that we ran last year together with Ryan and Carolyn Rose at Carnegie Mellon and Dragan Gasevich. And we wanted to design a MOOC approach. I think actually Justin Dillinger from UTA, from Link Lab, is going to be giving a talk on this tomorrow. And so we really wanted to try and get at the ways in which we could think about spaces as not being owned by us, but being owned by learners. And we sort of had this vision, well, what if you had people who, instead of going, content, lecture, so on, what if you could move them into a network, participate in a network, experience what it's like to form, validate, grow, and challenge knowledge. That's essentially what we tried to do. Most learners hated it, but we still did it. And we'll do it again, but maybe a little better. And so, but the research at this point is now starting to catch up a little bit, because now you have edX and Coursera that have a terrific amount of data set, and you've got some wickedly bright researchers working on these problems. And we're starting to see that these MOOCs are actually quite nuanced. They're addressing a different audience than we thought they would. They're no longer disrupting the university system. Instead, they're most likely going to be subsumed into and become a part of the university system. And that's reflected with edX, for example, the partnership with ASU. There's a recent one with Texas that was announced on something similar, this idea of getting the first year access through MOOCs. We've also seen, in combination with those trajectories, this granularization of assessment, that we're starting to think differently about what does it mean to be competent. Can we work with badges and alternative credentialing formats as indicators of an individual's competence, rather than just a single degree that is far too big, and instead of a scalpel, you're trying to solve a problem with a sledgehammer. So then we look briefly at the higher education system. It looks something like this. It's an integrated system with multiple players that are doing multiple things. And so you have the research, the administration, the curriculum going on. We've got the funding structures, but we have some soft elements, the legacy connections to other systems, the reputation, trust, and relevance of the system. So this is basically an image of what higher education looks like as a complete system. What's interesting today is we're moving from an integrated system to something that looks more like an ecosystem. So this entire model is being rapidly unbundled through startups and through new companies coming online that want to serve a sector of that. So if you want to move online rapidly, but you're not feeling comfortable doing it, then you'll have the opportunity to hire that capability by working with a provider in that space. So this process of being unbundled really just leads to the next stage, which is rebundling. And that's where we're starting to enter into. Once you pull the pieces apart, you have to reconnect them. And when you reconnect them, you create new power structures. So revolutionaries conserve once they've had their revolution. And we're just at the point of still trying to pick the system apart a little bit. We're starting to see government response that, yeah, we should pick this apart a bit. We're seeing the influence of alternative credentialing, alternative pathways into the labor market outside the university sector, growing amount of corporate providers in this space, boot camps, and so on. So we're at that point now where we're going to, in the next 5 years, start restitching a new university model or a new model of higher education. So let's just leave it there. But let's talk change a little bit. And I'm going to take a slight meander for about 3 slides, and then I'll return to things that I actually care about. So change is a really complicated thing. It certainly isn't linear, but change is fundamentally a process of power re-architecting. And so if you look at the models of change that have traditionally been used by, or at least advocated for, whether it's creative destruction, Joseph Schumpeter, which essentially informs the disruptive theory of Christensen. But you have a few models that I find a little more appealing. There's 3 in particular, and one that I favor above the others, which I'll get into a little bit. So there's the idea of a paradigm shift. So Thomas Kuhn's Scientific Revolutions, but Brian Arthur's also addressed this in his text, where he looks at the role that technology plays in our lives. We have the long cycle of adoption. This is an important one that we're just starting to see the benefits of this in higher education. So Paul A. David did a paper where he looked at the electrification of America, and that was how long did it take from the time that electricity was made available until the time it made a systemic impact. It's about a